From Ashes to New's Blackout is the amalgamation of the band's past work that I absolutely needed. Introduction. This blog/video may be a little bit of old news at this point, but I felt like this record warranted its own dedicated review from the time I first heard it, so I have, clearly, committed to making this regardless of the timing, and I've turned out being glad that I've let this album, and therefore this review for it, marinate. I've come to listen to Blackout several times over the weeks since its release, and I feel like it has gotten better each time. Over my several listens, I've come to change how I want to talk about it, to the point of changing the title not just once, but twice, to really give it the respect it deserves, the respect this band deserves, as From Ashes to New was a fairly formative band for me back in 2016 and 2017. The band is actually indirectly the reason I became such a big fan of Trivium, who were my favorite band for a few years after 2017 as well, but that's a story for another time and for a different video. More to the point, I love From Ashes to New, but my favorite releases from them have always been their 2013 self-titled EP and 2016's Day One. I've never disliked The Future or Panic, but they never did quite what I loved from the band, despite my really enjoying them for what they were at the time, including some songs that I still have incredible soft spots for, like My Name and the verses of The Future being incredible. I could never truly identify why it was the case that within 6 or 9 months after those albums dropped, I rarely, if ever, felt driven to listen to them again. That is, until the last couple years, when I finally began to realize that it's because the more metalcore elements, even the electronic elements too, in the band's sound back in those first couple releases, are just one of the things I love about music. Metalcore, 2010 and 2020's metalcore especially, much more than 2000's, is my favorite genre by a substantial margin. I didn't know it quite so actively at the time that From Ashes to New was really my introduction to the style, but that is what those releases were. Not quite so much the later releases. Sure, those things could be found in the music here and there, and the same basic principles can be found in the band's writing philosophy, particularly due to Matt's drive, but something about it all, combined with the new lineup, most notably Danny as the new clean and unclean vocalist, never quite felt the same to me. That is, until recently, when Blackout finally released after what seems like might have been at least a little bit of development hell, so to speak, on the back end. I feel like Blackout is the best version of this modern era of the band, coming to a place that almost feels like a new era entirely. It is the closest return to that old sound I missed so much that they've come to since the new lineup, but it also keeps what has worked the best in their more recent work too, making something nearly brand new and is, in my view, better off for that evolution. Part 1. The Past Eras of From Ashes to New. I've already made mention up to this point of eras of From Ashes to New since their inception. Prior to 2023, I would say the decade of music from them up to now could be pretty distinctly split into two of those eras, and anybody who listens to their releases from before this year would undoubtedly agree. The first era of the band comes from essentially the band's initial lasting lineup, with Chris Musser on vocals, Matt Brandyberry rapping, Lance Dowdle on lead guitar, Brandon Creeder on backing guitars and unclean vocals, both guitarists covered bass duties, and Tim Donofrio on the drums. Granted, the self-titled EP featured a different lead guitarist and drummer, plus a dedicated bassist, but for all intents and purposes, the band's lineup leading up to and immediately following Day One, to me, makes up the identity of their early material. The self-titled EP and Day One are fantastic records, blending a metalcore sound with Matt's hip-hop and rap in such a beautiful way that I've just found myself always enthralled. To this day, that EP remains amongst my favorite music releases of all time. The writing in this early material was tight, it was heavy, and it was fun to listen to, while also featuring a lyrical depth that even now I can still find new appreciation for each time I listen. But the lineup changed drastically in 2017, when Brandon, Tim, and Chris all departed from the band at one point or another. Matt and Lance had to essentially found the band again, rebuild from ashes to new again, pun obviously intended. Thus began the second era of the band. In the latter end of 2017 and leading into 2018, or somewhere thereabouts, the new lineup was announced alongside teasers for material from a new album, The Future. Danny Case officially came on board for clean and unclean vocals, and Matty Madiro, whom I'm calling as such to help distinguish him from Matt Brandyberry, came to pick up drum duty, and the lineup has remained this way ever since, with Matt picking up guitars and bass alongside Lance as well. And so The Future released in 2018, plus several other standalone singles, some of which definitely should have been on that album, I might add, and Panic came later in 2020. The new sound the band found in these years still had the same lyrical core and foundations, but the music was notably different. When it got heavy, it wasn't exactly the same kind of heavy as their previous work was, and they did a lot more with catchy melodies compared to before. Furthermore, as the band had always had at least a little bit of Linkin Park influence, as all rap rock, rapcore, or similar bands, amongst others, are naturally going to, the heavy moments of the music grew to resemble that a bit more distinctly. This particular element is quite identifiable in the breakdowns of the band's newer work, such as in Side Effects. But generally speaking, this era of the band was about the melodies and the choruses, not quite so much on the rhythmic core sound of before, and taking a slight step back even on Matt's rapping. Don't get me wrong though, when Matt went off, he went off. Songs like My Name, despite no longer really appearing in my repeated rotation, continue to have an absurd soft spot for me, and the verses of The Future, the title track of that album, are insane. I still greatly enjoyed this era of the band for what it was, but whenever I came back to From Ashes to New once in a while, it was always their earlier stuff I went to. There's a chance that'll be changing somewhat, and I'm quite excited to say that. Part 2. The new era of From Ashes to New. The next era of the band, or at least what I sense is a new era musically, fortunately comes with no lineup changes. As it turns out, it seems these four guys get along very well, and all of their own genuine input and humor is almost as rewarding to follow as the music itself some days. It makes me so happy to see these guys get the attention they deserve and truly start to blow up the last couple years. With the last few years and this relationship, the band has created a new album in Blackout that I think does the best job of melding the sensibilities of the band's past, taking the most notable of everything they've done to make something truly special, and that I think I may very well return to as much or more than Day One, though admittedly likely not the self-titled EP. Blackout still takes much of its DNA and stylistic tendencies so far as Danny is concerned from The Future and Panic, but I'd argue that it simply relies on what worked and sounded best from those two records, distilling the inherent quality in that writing to something measurably repeatable. Then what the band does next is tap into the heavy heavies that The Future largely lacked, occasionally channeling it towards that Linkin Park style breakdown like in Legacy, but also channeling it towards a more classic From Ashes to New style elsewhere, such as the breakdowns in, well, basically every other song on the record. But it isn't just heavies either, it's also the other writing as well. Songs like Hate Me Too could have been ripped straight from Panic, but even when the tracks do that, they still only rely on what really sounded best from that era. Nearly everything about Blackout is an amalgamation of what I like most from both of the band's eras into something totally fresh and new. And it's really heavy too at times, which I love. Until We Break has a breakdown with a drop pitch tuning, though maybe they just pitch shifted it, I don't know the technicalities too much, unlike anything the band has ever done. Dead to Me is one of the most FU songs they've ever put out, even beyond some of the material on Day One. Armageddon gets existential with its material to heighten the music. Broken by Design has a quicker pace than most of their work. Even Monster and Me, which is basically just if Hobson made a metal song. And speaking of, Matt's rapping and his lyrics here are up there and even beyond anything he's done before. I love a lot of the self-titled verses, and Day One certainly has its moments of lyrical genius. The Future has some of his best writing when it does come out. The verses of the title track, like I mentioned earlier, are just so damn good. But Blackout has verses in Monster and Me, Legacy, and so much more with lines that received a certified "that's a bar" reaction. There's just so much to appreciate between all the various elements of Blackout that make it a truly standout release for From Ashes to New, and particularly for where they go from here. Conclusion. So where do the boys go from here? A good question that I couldn't begin to answer. All I wanted going into this was for the heavy to come back full force, and it did not disappoint. Not to say that heavier is necessarily better, but when it's good, that's totally my jam over just simple alt-metal material these days. I think From Ashes to New have finally come up on the music they love to make most, and they've been having fun making it and touring it together, and that's frankly good enough for me. Whatever they decide to experiment with next in their musical evolution, I'm sure will meet similar levels of brilliance that this album has. I'm glad I didn't rush this review out, and that I put more thought into its title than I initially had to. I wasn't initially into Hate Me Too, but the repeated listens changed that. The contrast between the fun bop of the music and the semi-messed up lyrics is brilliant. Hope You're Happy and Barely Breathing I initially passed over, but discovered they also have a lot of meaning that I connect to as well. The whole back half initially blew me away with breakdown after breakdown, but continued to impress me for other reasons each new spin as well. It took a couple rotations to fully sell itself, but now that it has, I'm more sold on Blackout than I think I ever was with the two previous albums. I congratulate the band for what they have achieved here, and I can't wait to see what they do next.